Hi Year 11s. One of the main pieces of feedback that quite a few of you gave me in regards to our pivot surveys is that you wanted less PowerPoints and writing notes in class. Now, I understand that it is quite difficult, but you do need to get the information some way. So I thought rather than making you sit there and write for 90 minutes, you could watch a short video by me on what we're about to do in class. So this is our first one. We'll see how it goes. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the history and the context to 12 Angry Men and Montana 1948. Now, 12 Angry Men is set particularly in the 1950s in America. Obviously, Montana 1948 is 1948 in America, but they both sort of have a similar setting. Okay, and this was generally a time of happiness in the US. World War II was over, there was money starting to come in and lots of people around again. But that also meant that there were lots of internal conflicts that we can actually look at within those texts as well. So, like I said, World War II ended in 1945, and this started something called the boom. That meant that servicemen started to return home, and many of them wanted that American dream of having a family, having a job, having a house with a white picket fence, earning enough money to support, those around them, and generally being sort of wealthy and prosperous. This is also where we get this idea of a middle class. So quite a few of you may know people or have family or yourselves be in the middle class, and that comes from this idea of not having to work too hard to get the money that you need, but still working hard enough to feel successful. Right? And during this time, many people, because the men were coming back, they started to get married, and a lot of women started having children. This is why we get a generation called the baby boomers. Okay, they were born during these sort of 1945 to about 1965, where a lot of people were coming back from war. There was lots and lots of children, so it was a boom. It was a big, almost explosion of children. So to try and combat this, the US government introduced something called the GI Bill. Okay, GI meaning Government Issue Bill, which is what the nickname for American soldiers. And this meant that US servicemen could be given grants to help them purchase a house, go to university, or try and somehow improve their lives. A bit like almost like a Centrelink grant. So there was also a boom in American industry during this time, meaning that a lot more products were being made, there were a lot more factories open, a lot more people were also able to consume or spend money to buy these items. So there was a lot more demand for American-made products, and therefore America as an economy started getting a lot more money. But there were some problems with that. Even though America was exporting a lot of their goods, it meant that they then had to try and find more people to employ, which could be quite tricky. All right? And there were more opportunities to sell goods, but again, it meant that the demand was higher and trying to find those resources was a lot harder. Okay? So suburbs started to become a lot more popular during this time. People wanted to live as close to the city as they possibly could, but because space is limited, they found that they really had to move outside. And we see that a lot, particularly with things like 12 Angry Men. The men that are in the New York jury room don't necessarily live within the city itself. They sort of lived outside, and they wanted to. The ones that express themselves as being wealthier or having more opportunities generally are the ones that talk about the suburbs. Okay. But like I said, it also means there are fewer job opportunities, there's lots of unemployment, and prices start to inflate. That means prices go up without income coming up. And this is the base almost message coming through in 12 Angry Men, is that because these people all of a sudden don't have employment, they don't have any money, and they can't afford anything, they turn to a life of crime. So when we're talking about the ghettos and the slums in 12 Angry Men, these are the whole suburbs or areas that are known for their lower income earner population. Okay, they're really poorly maintained, they have a high rate of crime because there are not those opportunities because there's too many people to fill those jobs. Now, we don't see this as much in 1948, only because it is set in a different location, but we'll get to those issues in a second. Right. Again, entertainment is not something we see a lot. You see it a little bit in Montana, in that there's a shift in this idea of what is popular and what is right. Okay, so generally, entertainment showed this ideal American family of white parents, a mother, a father, and children that respected them. And as you can see, the characters in Montana really try to replicate that. Particularly, the father tries to push for this white nuclear family to be perfect, but all the issues surrounding them try and buck that system. So one of the biggest issues with 1950s America was this thing called the Red Scare. Okay, so that is referring to red being communist, and there's a real fear of the other. Okay, and even though we don't see this problem with communism so much in our texts, there is this problem with the outsider and people being un-American, right? And so there was this great hysteria over communism threatening the US and trying to take over America. So particularly when the characters talk about those outside of their community, they are showing this fear that all of a sudden, white, perfect Christian America may not be there anymore. And even though generally this fear was about communism, you do see it leach through into other aspects of society, particularly with Black Americans and also with Native Americans with issues with alcoholism and smoking and crime, etc. And a lot of this comes out of a gentleman by the name of Senator Joseph McCarthy. Okay, he was a politician, he was a congressman, which is a bit like our Senate, and he was trying to claim that he had a list of all these communists working in the government. So this created this real paranoia about people who were not particularly white, in particular, and not particularly American. Okay, so even if you had a foreign-sounding last name, people were a little bit suspicious of you purely because you weren't seen as this great American. So there was a possibility that you were spying for the communists. And we see this a little bit in particularly 12 Angry Men, not necessarily about communism, but this idea about people who are not the same as everybody else, being the outsider and not sort of cared about as much. Yes, you see it in Montana, particularly with the treatment of the Native Americans, but that is more so a internal conflict rather than this idea of the outsider being someone that's suspicious. So this, like I said, started this real idea of paranoia. Okay, so there are bombshells potentially going to drop. So shelters started to become really popular, and you see it even today if you ever watch Doomsday Preppers on Netflix. They really go for this idea of trying to be safe from anything. They're building bunkers underground out of steel. Back in the 50s, they would have been made out of lead, so that wouldn't have exactly been healthy for you. And they're filled with non-perishable food. There's room for people to hide, get shelter. And even in schools, they were taught to duck and cover, which is to get under the desk and cover their heads, thinking that that would help them from nuclear fallout. And again, this paranoia leaches through into other parts of society that we see in our texts. And lastly, I want to talk a little bit about civil and social unrest. This is the major part of conflict that we see in our texts. It's this idea that even though the US was standing for this idea of equality and democracy and people's rights, meaning why they were so against communism, they openly accepted and practiced discrimination, particularly against African Americans, but they do see it against Native Americans as well. Okay, there were these things called the Jim Crow laws that were regulations that made it legal for areas such as public buildings, bathrooms, schools, theatres, public transport, anywhere that had to be used by big groups of people to be racially segregated. They were saying that because even though people were separated, they were still considered equal. Okay, and so we get this separate but equal, which became a big issue because they were not giving them exactly the same facilities. It was more so that the white people got what they needed and whatever was left over was for African Americans or anyone who was not white. Okay? And this created a great atmosphere of superiority to white people, and you see it in both texts. Okay, all of the jurors are white. Now, we are not told the race of the accused boy, but the way that they speak about the ghettos and the slums, it is assumed he is either African American or possibly from South America or a Latina country. So we know he's an outsider and he is coloured. And it's the same in Montana 1948. There's this superiority of the family, particularly being white and being police officers, that they seem to be better than the Native Americans living around them. Okay. And there were lots of sort of horrifying consequences of this, and we can talk about this in class if you wish. But the idea that there were things like lynching, okay, so white men hanging up black men by trees, and there's a really unusual song about it, which, if you ask your teacher, you may be able to hear, called Strange Fruit. You see this a lot in things like To Kill a Mockingbird, if any of you were in SEAL. And it's this increase in white men taking almost justice into their own hands and ultimately beating and killing black people purely for just being black. Okay. There was also increased arrests and deaths of black people, poor treatment within incarceration, limited access to basic needs, and generally employers were going to hire a white person over a black person. Okay. So it's this ingrained mentality that the entire society should be white. And this is one of the key messages that comes through in both our texts, is this idea about not treating people differently because of the colour of their skin. So I'm going to leave it there for today. We will continue on with this in class, but I really hope you're able to take some decent notes. Please bring them with you and we'll go over them as a class. I'll see you next lesson.